So you think your opponent's a dirty, dirty cheater. Are they really? Well, in today's video, we are going to go through all of the most popular way that people actually cheat, and I'm going to start it off with this. The reality is most likely your opponent wasn't cheating. Your opponent was just playing a little bit sloppy and did something wrong, or they're newer, they didn't understand the way a rule interacted, and they did something incorrect because they just had an incomplete understanding of how Warhammer works. Warhammer is a very complicated game, and most of the time, people are just, a little bit uneducated on it, not actually being dirty, dirty cheaters. But if they are dirty, dirty cheaters, chances are they're doing one of these strategies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rate all these cheating, and I'm going to rate them on a scale of thumbs downs. One thumbs down means that this is a action that can be accidental. It's something that you should just let your opponent know about so that they stop doing it. Two, if you see these types of things, if I give them two up and thumbs downs, you're going to be like, this is suspicious. This person could be doing this intentionally. And then if you see three thumbs downs, it's almost always that person is very intentionally cheating, and they should always immediately be reported to the TO. Now, that being said, all of these actions should always be discussed with the TO, because what will happen is when you're in your local meta, there will always be problem players. Some of these problem players aren't cheaters, but they do some shall we say, dirtier things while they're playing, and the TOs need to be aware of this. If they don't know about it, then they can't actually do anything about it. Just to give like a fairly anecdotal story, in our local meta, we've got a guy who was actually relatively well known for being a pretty dirty player, but no one ever really reported him to the TO. So when we ran into a scenario where he kind of cheated at a tournament, well, basically definitely cheated at a tournament, no, not even kind of, retroactively, there was basically nothing the TOs could do about it, because it was just it wasn't like a blatant cheat, but when you knew everything else you knew about him, you basically can make the assumption that it was cheating. So the TOs couldn't really do much about it because they didn't have any of the background information about this player. So building a profile on problem players actually is a thing. So do that. Now, as we're going through some of these cheating activities, I'm going to let you know what you can do about it to put a stop to your opponent. Because the reality is most of the times, if you see some of these things that I'm going to talk about, it's just people not understanding an interaction, or people just playing a little bit sloppy. However, some of them will be blatant. So let's get right into it. Let's rate these cheating. So what are the most common ways that people cheat? Number one, measuring advantageously. Let me just bring this down so you guys can see. Oh, no, you know what? It's got to be. All right, whatever. I cut it off on the video. It'll be fine. So this can be sloppy play. What I mean by measuring advantageously, well, measuring movements, charges, range, or aura ranges just slightly longer than is actually allowed. Most of the time, what you'll see is people will take their tape measurers, and then they'll be measuring like at an angle like this, and they'll be measuring from pretty far up on the table, just looking down on it, saying, oh, that looks like 6 inches. But in reality, it was 7.5 inches. So if you see your person and they're measuring a little bit sloppily, like pretty much everyone I've ever seen play Warhammer does, then what I would recommend is just being, hey, would you mind just using these sticks? And when I play, oh man, I don't even have my bag right next to me. But when I play, I have like these flat 6-inch sticks, 9-inch sticks, 3-inch sticks that are really, really good for like pylons, consolidates. And I'll just put them on the board, and I'll use that as my measurement, because you kind of can't argue about it. It's cut exactly 6 inches. If your opponent starts at the base of the stick and moves all the way towards the top of it, they went exactly 6 inches. So I'll throw those down on the table and just be like, here, use this. This will make it much more accurate for you. And 9.9 times out of 10, your opponent will be like, oh, that's awesome. That makes this so much easier. Another thing that they'll do is they'll like bend the tape measure around a board around a corner, and they'll be like, oh, I can clearly just teleport this far. Well, you can't really actually move that far, because you have to move on the outside of the base at all times, right? So measuring advantageously, this is something that people do constantly. They do this on your pylons and your consolidates. Oh my gosh, they ship the tape measure from the base's edge to the model's center, and they'll gain edges doing it. Most of the time, this is not going to be cheating, but this is something that you're going to see at every single tournament you ever go to, because people be sloppy, yo. So what I recommend when you see this, just give them the sticks. Be like, hey, let's try to measure a little bit more accurately, if you don't mind. I think you might have accidentally taken an extra inch there. Do this. People pretty much always clean up on the spot, because it's almost never going to be actually intentional. Sometimes it will be. All right, number two, misrepresenting rules. Now, this one gets a little bit more suspicious. I'm going to give this one 2 thumbs down instead of 1 thumbs down. This is going to be something like claiming a unit has abilities or rules that it doesn't. So you'll see, oh yeah, this unit is -1 damage. but they're not -1 damage, right? Or this unit hits on 2s, but they hit on 3s. Now, yes, it is possible for someone to be wrong. I've been wrong. At the beginning of the edition, I had thought that beast bosses for orcs had an OCF2, just like all the beast snags they attached to all had an OCF2. I was wrong. It was OC1. Now, it never really came up where it actually mattered in a game, but I had been playing them as OC2. So, I mean, there's times where people can just overlook a small little detail and get it wrong, and that's okay. I'm not claiming that every single time someone gets something wrong, it's really sus. But if you see that your opponent tends to have, oh, my units hit on 2s, but actually they hit on 3s, or if my unit is all these little details, right? Or maybe this unit has a scoot and shoot, but actually it's another unit that has a scoot and shoot, and this one has an auto advance 6. These are things that people will do a lot, especially with lesser used armies, and they'll try to intimidate you with the fact that you just don't know their army because you haven't played it a bunch. So you can see this, and it's generally pretty suspicious when you see your person just saying the rules wrong. Now, of course, it's less suspicious if the person's a brand new player, but this is definitely a way that people will cheat. They'll also do the same things with stratagems. The general rule of thumb, here's the deal, guys. If your opponent's ability or rule sounds like it isn't right, if something doesn't add up, all you got to do is ask your opponent to show you the rule. The onus is on them to show you the rule. You know what? I don't think that's right. I don't think you actually ignore all modifiers. I'm pretty sure you only ignore hit modifiers and like ballistic skill modifiers. And your opponent says, no, I definitely ignore all modifiers. Okay, can you just read the stratagem to me? And they'll bring out the stratagem and actually have them show it to you. Don't even say read it to you. Have them show you the stratagem because there's been whole controversies over this. And then you read the stratagem, and the stratagem says, oh, actually, they only ignore modifiers to hit a weapon skill. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean cheating because your opponent could have read ignore modifier and just assumed it meant ignore modifier, all modifiers, because that rule does pop up sometimes in the game, but it doesn't look good. So if something sounds suspicious or sounds a little bit off, just ask your opponent to show you the rules. If they can't show you the rules, they lose the argument. They're wrong. It doesn't just no. They have to be able to show you the rules. All right, there you go. Now, selective memory. Now, this is number 3. This is only 1 thumbs down. 1 thumbs down because 1 thumbs down means this is something that can happen just because of human error. But when it happens a lot, it definitely tends to get a little bit more suspicious. So this is going to be like when you're forgetting to roll for drawbacks. Like, oh, I forgot to roll my hazardous. Well, yeah, okay, you're in the groove things, you're moving. Okay, I can see how someone can forget to roll hazardous. Or if you're a Imperial Knight player and you move through a wall and they forget to roll the 1 dice to see if they get battle shocks. It just happens so rarely that people can forget these things. This isn't always like intentional cheating. A lot of times this is just honest mistakes. But when these things start to add up into aggregate, then it becomes a little bit more sus. So you definitely need to pay attention to these types of things. Generally, what goes around in the selective memory is also people who will always remember the rules and stuff that help them, but they'll never remember the rules that hurt them. So if they're always remembering everything perfectly except for the stuff that can hurt them, well, in that scenario, then you're starting to be a little bit more suspicious. When this happens, what I would do is I'd be like, hey, man, I really need you to remember your rules. It's not fair to put the onus on me to remember your rules for you. So I always just have this conversation with my opponents, and every time I have these conversations, you might think that it's uncomfortable. It's really not. It takes like 2 seconds to say it, and then it leads to a much more pleasant and wonderful experience for both players. So just don't be afraid to poke your person and be like, hey, listen, man, you've forgotten about your hazards like 3 times this game. I really need you to remember that because it's not fair to require me to remember your rules for you. All right, just put it that way, and things are going to be a lot better. And of course, if it's more of a problem, you can always just call a TO, and the TO would be within their rights to actually drop a yellow card on their opponent for not remembering their rules correctly. All right, number 4, moving units illegally. This goes along with the moving units a little bit too far. This will be things like moving units through walls or terrain incorrectly, consolidating, piling in farther than 3 inches. Like I said, you can always cut that off by giving them the 3-inch widget because that makes it a lot easier. Using the hand scoop method to casually shift models more than allowed. Now, I'm guilty of this as well sometimes because what I'll do is I will, if I'm planning on a charge, occasionally what I'll do is I will measure the closest model and the furthest away model, and then the guys in between, sometimes I'll just pick them up and put them in the middle. Now, when I do this, I always try to make sure that it's very obvious I'm moving them less than the actual maximum distance they can move. But I've done things like this. So if people are moving a little sloppy like this sometimes, don't necessarily jump the gun. I'm going to give this 1 thumbs down. This is what I would generally refer to as slop play, but not necessarily cheating. Now, of course, like as we discussed earlier, the more the slop play, the more likely that it's a dirty player. Re-roll abuse for number 5. This is going to get 2 thumbs downs. This is a player who is a little bit sus. This is going to be the person who's going to re-roll dice without paying the CP because the dice is cocked. So every single time they roll a 1, oh, it's cocked, I get to re-roll it. But every single time you roll a 6, oh, it's cocked, you have to re-roll it. And every time they roll a 6, oh no, that's perfectly flat. No need for re-rolls, right? This is a person that I've played. I'm sure this is a person that you've played. The way I cut this off is I don't even allow this to ever become a thing in my games. At the beginning of the game, what I'll do is I will define what a cocked dice is. I will say anything that is not 100% flat or anything that is not in the dice tray needs to be re-rolled. And once you and your opponent just agree upon a standard, well then there's not going to be any issues because you have a standard that is agreed upon. And this isn't always necessarily a dirty player. Some people will have different definitions of what cocked is. Some people like the method where well, if they can stack another dice on top of the first dice, then it's good to go. So there's different standards. I always head this off and just say, nope, there will never be any arguments about this. It is only 100% flat dice. If it's not 100% flat, it gets re-rolled no matter what. And that tends to solve that problem. And then they'll also do things like retroactively, they'll apply rules like sustained hits or lethal hits on previously rolled dice. This will be something like your opponent throws a bunch of dice, sees some 6s, and they'll be like, and they'll say, oh, you know, I meant to use sustained hits on it. Obviously, I would have used sustained hits on this position. Would you mind if I split that strat? Well, for me, I'd be like, well, no, yeah, I do mind actually. You can't do that. You have to declare that before you roll your dice. And yeah, just don't let your opponent do that because it's not obvious that they would have used that stratagem, not unless they looked at you in the face and said, hey, I'm going to use this stratagem, and then do you know what I mean? Then they use the stratagem. So I would never allow someone to retroactively do that because it's not obvious, not unless they specifically declared it. Okay, so that gets 2 thumbs down. It is sus when people do stuff like that. Clock management, especially in time games, I'm going to give this a 1 thumbs down. This is because this is generally can be due to people who are not familiar with the clock or people who are just struggling in other areas of the game. But basically, this will happen when you're rushing your opponents or when you're behind because you don't have as much time as your opponent. So you're trying to like start hitting the clock to them a little bit more so they can roll their save throws. You're asking questions on the opponent's time, and I mean abusive questions like, "Hey, how does your reactive movement work? And I need you to show me the exact reactive movement, the exact wording of the reactive movement." Is it actually within 9 inches? Is it not within 10 inches? Well, there's no 10-inch reactive movement in the game. So people will actually press the issue to make your opponent take time to look things up just to drain the clock. So the way I handle this is if my opponent's asking me questions and it's more than like a 2-second answer, I put the clock on them while I provide them with the answer. Because that's their time, that's their question. Once you start putting the clock on your opponent to answer their questions, suddenly they don't do the abusive questions. And remember, I only do this when I suspect abusive use of this, right? I wouldn't do it on someone who's asking honest questions. So you can just knock that out right out of the gate. If your opponent is asking abusive questions, just go ahead and they're trying to drain your clock. Put the clock on them while you look up their answers. Another thing that they'll do with clock management is sometimes people will deploy during their opponent's time. So I'm doing my measurements in my deployment phase. I'm dropping things. I'm measuring all my angles, and my opponent is doing the same thing on their time. And so as soon as I pass the clock to them, they just hit it back to me to make me start measuring, and then they start deploying again. This is a big, big no-no. I will look at my opponent and say, hey, you cannot put your models on the table while I am deploying. I don't care. You can't have them stand anywhere. You can't pre-deploy. You can't just pre-measure. When I'm deploying, that's me doing things on the table. When you're deploying, that's you doing things on the table. So once I have passed the clock to you, then you can start putting your models down and checking angles and stuff. You may not deploy on my time. That gets very, very abusive. All right, number 7. Now, this is going to be our first 3 thumbs downs. If you see special gear, they're probably cheating. This is like special dice or measurement sticks. If you're seeing dice that have multiple 6s on it, or if you have dice that have pictures on, or if you have dice that like they suspiciously roll more 6s than you would expect, or even roll more 1s than you might expect. Well, the way that you solve this is you grab those darn dice and you play with them. So if you suspect that this person's dice is rolling a little too well, what you do is you start rolling them. And if you're rolling a little too well, then you look at your TO, you call them over, be like, I think these dice are docked, or hey, can you go check these dice? That's when you do the flush test. That's when you do all sorts of things. But my first, when I see my, if I see my opponent's dice are actually too good, and I have a suspicion, I start rolling their dice, and I look at my opponent, and I'll tell them like, hey, listen, I would like to start rolling your dice. And if they have an issue with it, that's a big red flag. If they have no issue with it, well, then you start rolling it. And if they just roll normal, I mean, it is what it is. But if I have the suspicions, I'm going to tell my opponent, hey, I need to start rolling your dice for the rest of the game because this doesn't seem right. And then if it continues to not seem right, especially when you do that, you get that T over there, right, real quick. Another thing people will do is they'll actually shave measuring sticks, or they'll take like a 9-inch measuring stick and they'll shave it to make it a little bit shorter than 9 inches, so that for like deep strike screening and stuff, they'll use that to check how closely they can deep strike. So they'll do stuff like this as well. So if you think a 6-inch measuring stick or a 9-inch measurement stick is too short or even too long, then just put it next to the ruler. Actually use the ruler to measure it, and you'll see, oh, well, it's accurate or it's not accurate. All right, just a few more for you here, and then we'll finish off today for the day. Mismanaging CP. This is going to be a single thumbs down. People do this on accident, but people can absolutely do this intentionally. So this is when people have more CP than they actually have. And this will happen because, oh, hey, I'm going to command point reroll. They roll the dice, but they forget to go and take the CP down. The way that I solve this is I make sure every single game I have my dice that represents my CP on a very visible point, and I put my opponent's dice at the same place. Now, some people will have one dice for them and a dice for their opponent, and they'll let their opponent keep track as well, and you'll just keep track of both at the same time. I've seen people do this. This is no problem, but when you have this very physical representation of how much command points you have left, it's very, very useful. Number 9. Oh, actually, another one. This is one that happens all the time as well. So if you have a unit that can discount command points, like a captain from Space Marines, or you have like Marnius Calgar who gives a command point. Well, I use tokens. I think you should always use a token. Be like, hey, once this token is removed, that's when my captain, even if I have 3 captains, has used their ability to discount. So if now I'm going to remove that token, which denotes that I can't use that ability again this battle round. That generally makes it a lot easier, because sometimes people will ask themselves, or they'll ask out loud to you, and they'll say, huh, have I used my free CP this turn? And both of you go, oh, I don't remember. Well, you need a token to represent it. Makes it much, much easier. All right, number 9, rules that only exist in other detachments. This gets 2 thumbs down. This is sus. I had a client who was playing in a GT maybe a few weeks ago, and they were playing against an Eldar player who was playing, I think, Warhost, and they used a stratagem to make their models -1 damage. Now, my client didn't actually know how Eldar played, because they were relatively new against the Eldar, so they just assumed that was correct. But in retrospect, they had messaged me and said that this unit was -1 damage, and I took a look. I was like, oh, that's not correct. You can't be -1 damage in that detachment. The only detachment that you could do that is the one for like the wraiths and stuff. And so he goes, oh, crap. Now, it turned out that this was not intentional. It was an opponent who pretty much only ever played the other detachment that did have a -1 detachment, and just like on reflex included it in this new army. Now, that's not cheating, but that is playing wrong, and that is deserving of punishment, because you are, even if you're not intentionally doing things wrong, you are responsible for playing your rules correctly. So they were deserving of a yellow card, even though they weren't intentionally doing that, right? So if the rule doesn't sound correct, ask to see the rule. If at the beginning of the game, always ask, what are these 6 stratagems for your opponent's army? I also recommend just opening up Wahapedia or any of your or the 40k app if you have access to the code, to look at the stratagems pregame as well, to make sure you know what your opponent has available to them. Number 10, extra models. This is 1 thumbs down for this is accidental. I've actually been guilty of this at a tournament. I played an entire tournament with an extra Vindicator tank before. Well, not entire tournament. I caught it after the 2nd round, and I reported myself. I got a yellow card for it, which I deserved, because I definitely played wrong. I did go to the TO. I told them what had happened. We zeroed my scores for the first 2 rounds, and I played the rest of the tournament. This is not like, if you're doing something sneaky like putting 11 models in a 10 model squad, that could be maybe a little more suspicious. If you have a whole extra unit, this will actually almost always be accidental. It's very hard to hide that, especially when you can just look what your opponent's army list is and very easily see that they don't have that model or unit in their army. So this can fluctuate between a single thumbs down or a triple thumbs down really quickly, based off how the extra models are on the tabletop. I have actually seen someone who puts like 13 models in a 10-man squad, and they start taking wounds behind the like cover, so their opponent can't see which models are being pulled, and it made it so that you had more wounds. So I've seen that, but I've also, been the guy who just brought an extra battle tank to a tournament and then was like, "Oh crap." And I went and earned my yellow card, and I wore my yellow card because I deserved it on that one. Then we have modeling for advantage. This is one I'm going to put 2 thumbs downs. This is something where you can use the wrong side bases. We were actually at the WTC one year, and we had a mirror match where our Thousand Suns player was playing against another team's Thousand Suns player, and both of them had Magnus. And when you held the other team's Magnus's base up to our team's Magnus's base was significantly larger, and it was the standard GW base. So watch stuff like that. If you see the wrong size base, I'm pretty much always going to say that this is intentional, unless it's in certain scenarios like, hey, you know what? I never updated my runt herd's base size. You know what? Oh, I can let that live. But if it's the current modern model and the base size is wrong, then it becomes a big, big problem. So you really need to watch for that. Other things people will do is they'll make a cool conversion, which is much easier to hide or significantly easier to move on the table. Now, if the TO has approved these conversions, it is what it is. But if the TO has not approved these conversions, these can be things that are very suspicious. So watch out for that modeling for advantage. Guys, this is a bunch of the ways that these are the common ways that people will cheat. There are some less common ways that we can maybe talk about in a different video. But if I missed any of the common ones, let me know down in the comments down below. And just remember, most of the time when you see these things happen, it's sloppy play or people just being a little bit newer. Most of the time, it's not cheating. I pretty much it would take a lot for me to actually accuse someone of intentionally cheating. So keep this in mind. If you think anything's are going on, this is how I would solve it as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to take off for today, and I hope you all have an incredible day. Crump on. Bye-bye.